Good afternoon. I'm here today to read the next part of our story, Brightstorm. I'm going to reread in chapter 19, which is called The Case Against Eudora Vane. Now, this is a little bit of a longer chapter, so you might find that you'd like to watch a little bit today and then the other part at some point over the weekend, ready for the next part on Monday. So I'll start reading and you can pause it if you need to take a little break. So chapter 19. The Aurora landed on the icy shore of the third continent. Arthur couldn't believe he'd travelled across so far. He felt he'd stepped into a wintry dream. While Harriet, Maudie and some other members of the crew busied themselves with the water change and their equipment checks, Arthur and Felicity walked a little way up the coastline, in case there was anything that could be added to the stores. But it was rock and ice as far as they could see. There was an absolute quiet to the land, and if it hadn't been for the distant chug of the Victorious's engines, Arthur would have felt as though they were the only living creatures in the entire wide. "We're here at last," Felicity said, smiling. "Is something bothering you, young Arthur?" He shrugged. "I guess a small part of me thought that maybe my father had survived, but look at it here. Who could survive on their own?" "Hope can drive us to do things we never thought possible, Arthur Brightstorm. Maybe you had to tell yourself that to give yourself the strength. And perhaps a part of the reason you came all this way wasn't just about your father." He wasn't sure what she meant. "You'll understand one day. Come on, there's clearly nothing edible around here." They soon took off again. Little by little, they were closing in on the Victorious. After half a day, as they were approaching the everlasting forest of the third continent, Harriet turned course southwesterly for a short time so they could keep a safe distance from the rival skyship. "We're nearly level with them," Maudie called, looking through her telescope. The whole crew stood poised on the portside deck, watching in anticipation. As Harriet steered onwards, Welby stood beside Maudie, looking through the binoscope and checking his readings. After a moment, he declared, "The Aurora is ahead!" The crew cheered, but Arthur remained quiet, focusing on the forest below. Maudie approached him. "What's the matter, Artie? You should be pleased." "I am, it's just..." The trees were packed tightly together, and it was impossible to see what lurked below. All Arthur could think about were the great prints that the Vane crew had found by the Brightstorm ship, and the huge pelt the Vane crew had brought back. He stared at the frozen treetops passing silently below. "If you wanted to hide a secret, it would be in there," he said. But Maudie had already left and was talking with Welby and exchanging notes. They flew on into the night, which was only short now they were so far south, lasting just a few chimes. The skies were eerily clear, and the almost full moon illuminated a vast landscape of white trees. It was beautiful, yet there was something unnerving about it, a looming blackness that seemed to be watching them. The further they went, the more he could feel it in his head. Strange words and thoughts, almost as though the darkness was talking to him, but that sounded ridiculous. A hand on his arm made him jump. "Are you all right? You've gone as pale as the moon," Maudie said, passing him a steaming cup. "It's the forest. It's so black." She frowned. "Oh, it looks pretty bright with the snow on the floor." "No, I mean inside the forest. I can hear something." Maudie frowned. "You're thinking of the beasts, aren't you?" He nodded. "Artie, you need to sleep. We can't land until light and we'll be perfectly safe altogether." He said, peering down. Were the whispers trying to tell him the sinister truth? "Artie, are you sure you're all right?" She pulled his arm. "Come on, you'll go into the cabin for a rest." Now would be a good time to pause if you want to take a break and come back to hear the next part of this chapter. If you're ready, I'm going to carry on. Arthur fell asleep quickly. The next thing he knew, a great boom and shudder rumbled every cell in his body. He sat up wide-eyed. Maudie looked over the side of the bunk. "What the grinding grommets was that?" They both leapt out of bed and began pulling on their boots. Footsteps thundered through the hallway, and suddenly the Aurora dipped at the front, sending them flying forwards. They scrambled into the passageway and Harriet dashed past. There's been some sort of explosion in the engine. The pressure gauge is going through the roof. I'm shutting down the engine. She's going to blow again. Brace for a crash landing and wrap yourself in anything you can find. I'll guide her into the trees the best I can. Arthur and Maudie ran back to their bunks, pulled the mattresses from their beds and wrapped them around themselves. The Aurora banked sideways and they lurched across the room. Through the portholes, the forest was a swathe of ghostly white-topped pines growing nearer by the second. The thought of going into the darkness of the forest was terrifying, but so was the thought of exploding mid-air. Why do you come? He turned behind to see who had spoken, but there was no one. Arthur tumbled, and then everything flew upward and hit the ceiling as the Aurora surged down. Flashes of white and darkness rolled past the window. Hideous crashing and spitting sounds were everywhere, and the whole juddered horribly. All he could see was the rush of branches as the skyship was engulfed by the forest. With a horrible crack, splinters of wood flew through the air, and again he tumbled. A bone-wrenching jolt threw him across the room. The cacophony of noise disappeared, and everything went very still, silent and black. There's an interesting word there. Cacophony. A cacophony is lots of noises all together, a bit like a racket. So there was a big racket, and then suddenly everything went silent and black. Arthur groaned. Every part of his body ached. He wiggled his toes and his fingers. Yep, still there. He tried to open his eyes, but his head pounded. Someone wiped his forehead with a cloth, and he heard Dr. Quirk's voice. It's just a cut, you'll be all right. The crash probably knocked you out for a while, but don't worry, everyone's alive. There are a few cracked ribs and some nasty bruises, and Welby has broken his wrist, but we were lucky. Arthur sat up. His head thrummed and everything spun. He fought the urge to faint. Whoa, careful, Harriet said. I have to find Maudie, he said, trying to stand. Harriet put a firm hand on him. You need to be still. Maudie's fine, she's helping the wounded. I'll tell her you're awake. The blurred shapes cleared, and around was utter devastation. The Aurora had been torn apart and was in two halves. The surrounding trees were bent, snapped, and charred, and debris littered the branches and forest floor. Debris. Parthena called from somewhere in the trees above. Stay here for a while. You took quite a bang to the head. I'll get a fire going. As soon as Harriet had gone, he tried to get up again, and Felicity ran over, her hair loose and dishevelled and her apron torn. Now, stay still, and that's an order, she said, waving her bent spoon at him. I guess the lucky spoon ran out of luck, he said. She smiled and shook her head. Oh, Arthur Brightstorm, joking at a time like this. Then she ripped up the edge from her apron and started re-bandaging his head. Let's sort this out. I was rushing the first time. What happened? Some sort of explosion. It's a miracle we're all still alive. Maudie ran out from behind the other half of the ship. Thank goodness you're all right. She crouched beside him and helped Felicity tie his bandage. They sat in sad silence and stared at the wreckage of the Aurora. A trail of smoke petered into the sky. Arthur couldn't speak. They'd come so close. After a while, Harriet returned, holding Arthur's iron arm. I found this dangling in a tree. It scared the life out of me until I realised what it was. I've started a campfire, but we need to gather supplies and salvage what we can before the short night comes again. She sat beside Arthur, who stared into space. Maudie, you can help Welby and Forbes assess the state of the engine and see what can be saved. I need to gather more wood for the fire or we'll freeze. Arthur, how's your head feeling now? Can you help? He nodded. He couldn't just sit staring at the chaos and disappointment for a moment longer. All right, I'll tell the rest of the crew and then we'll go. Arthur reached inside his iron arm. Thankfully, the piece of paper from the book was still there. He unfolded it and read, The Brightstorm moth, a new species discovered by Ernest Brightstorm in the Northern Isles, uses the light of the moon to ensure it travels in an absolutely straight line, allowing it to navigate successfully between two volcanic islands 50 miles apart and never stray from its path. He stared at the drawing of the Brightstorm moth, so intricate that it looked real. Maudie squeezed his shoulder. "Come on, I'll help you get your arm on before Harriet comes back. If you'd like to take another break, now is a good time. If you're ready, I'll carry on and tell you what happens next when they go to look for firewood." The forest was silent apart from the frozen undergrowth crunching beneath their feet. Harriet led the way. "We'll head back where the Aurora crashed through the trees and pick up some wood, and we may be able to find some evidence of what happened on the way." Fractured trees and branches were all around, and the ground was littered with various bits of metal and wood from the ship. "What will we do, Harriet?" Arthur said. "We don't wallow, we try and find out what happened, we regather, and we make a new plan." Harriet pointed at one of the metal objects by Arthur's feet. "What's that?" Arthur stooped and picked it up. It looked to be a piece of metal from the Aurora's engine. Harriet examined it. "It's from the hydro valve, but these marks are very irregular, almost as though it was gnawed through by, Arthur said, "by a creature." "What are you saying?" She stared at him, her eyes deadly serious. "It's ruptured. It would have likely caused a pump to blow. This looks like the explosion was deliberate." Arthur raised his eyebrows. "The silver insect! I saw it when we reached the third continent shore. It was small enough to have slipped inside the ship's engine room, I've noticed, but big enough to do some serious damage." Harriet ran a hand through her wayward hair. "You think it could be a sapient creature working on instructions?" He paused. He couldn't believe he'd not made the connection. Eudora Vane's brooch! "How hard was that knock to your head, Arthur?" Harriet wondered. "You've seen the silver brooch she wears, except I'm betting it's not jewellery at all. It's probably a sapient insect." "You're saying it was sabotage?" Arthur nodded. "And the other two ships had to drop out due to sudden damage. It's rather a coincidence, don't you think?" Harriet nodded. "Let's gather the wood and get back. We need to tell the crew in case you're right and Eudora tries anything else. We need to be wary of her and her whole team." They fell silent as the forest darkened around them, and they gathered wood into a large pile. The trees seemed to squeeze in around them in the fading light. Then he heard the voice in his head again. "Why do you come?" He flinched. It was probably the bang on his head that was messing with his mind. Harriet stopped and looked at him. "Are you all right? Maybe we should go back." He shook his head. I'm fine." "Why do you come?" He looked through the trees. Dark shapes loomed in the gloom, and he had the feeling that they were being watched. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what?" He shook his head. She paused and stared at him. "Come on. Even in this light, I can see how pale you've become. We've got enough wood for now. It's time to head back." Arthur didn't argue. He locked his iron arm into an arc, which he used to hook a bundle of the firewood. They went back to the Aurora. Arthur was glancing over his shoulder every few moments. Back at what remained of their ship, Felicity had gathered the scattered food supplies and organised them into rations. She was making soup in a big battered pot. As the crew sat subdued around the fire, Harriet told them of Arthur's suspicions. Then a familiar rumbling sounded in the distance. The engines of the Victorious. They froze as it flew nearer, until it was almost on top of them. Harriet ordered everyone to the tree line. Arthur dashed behind a tree with Maudie, and Harriet behind one nearby. From their hiding places, they watched as the ship appeared above them and came to a hovering standstill. Great gusts of smoke from the engine plumed into the devastated clearing made by the crash. "Having a little problem, Miss Culpepper?" Eudora called. Arthur looked from behind his tree up through the clearing. Beside Eudora, a man stood, holding a gun and grinning. It was Mr. Smethwick, the insurance representative who had visited them. Maudie pulled him back. Are you mad? It's him, the man from the insurance company. He's with her. We'd offered to help, but time is very short and we have the South Polaris to claim. If you could hand over your fuel, we could do with a little more, Eudora called. I'm afraid we don't have any pitch, Eudora, Harriet shouted. Eudora laughed. No pitch? Don't be absurd. Absurd. What are you powered by? All we need is water. Arthur couldn't help but take another look. Eudora's expression was ice cold. Her lips were tight with fury. She muttered something as though talking to herself, and then the silver brooch unfurled its wings and took flight in the direction of the skyship wreckage. It was a sapient insect. It whizzed past Arthur, sharp mandibles gnashing. He thought of the marks in the damaged hydra valve. The insect darted quickly amongst the wreckage of the Aurora looking for pitch, but of course there was none, so it flew back to Eudora. Pitch or not, it seems your journey is over. Enjoy your time in the forest, Miss Culpepper. The short night will be here soon. When the native beasts tire of their meagre pickings, you'll be a veritable feast. If they don't get you, the elements soon will. And with that, the engines fired up and the Victorious headed onwards, leaving a great plume of pitch smoke choking through the trees. So much for the explorer's code. Assist fellow travellers first. Come on, let's get prepared for the night, Harriet said, shaking her head. Arthur pulled Maudie to the side. I can't sit here while she gets away with what she did. Come on, Maudie, we're going after them. We can sneak away while no one's looking. Artie, you're not thinking straight. We'll lose them unless we go now. Maudie rolled her eyes. We need to think. You can't just go running off into the forest alone. But there was no time. The Victorious was disappearing, and Arthur hadn't come all this way for nothing. He was going to find Dad's ship. He'd chase the sound of the Victorious south until he found it. Are you coming or not? She planted her feet and put her hands on her hips. Arthur Brightstorm, you are not thinking. Fine, he snapped, and Arthur stormed off into the forest. Maudie shouted after him. He broke into a run, trying desperately to keep up with the fading engines. Arthur, what are you doing? Harriet called. But he couldn't stop, because if he did, reality would catch up with him, that Dad was really gone forever, that he had no idea what the future looked like anymore, and that he might never find the truth and be able to clear the Brightstorm name. He charged onwards, snow dragging at his feet and pine branches clawing at his clothes. After a while, the hurried slur of footsteps through snow caught up with him. Harriet grabbed his shoulder. They both came to a standstill, gasping for breath. The Victorious was miles away already. It was hopeless. Harriet glared at Arthur. What in all the wide are you thinking? I have responsibility for the crew, Arthur Brightstorm, and I will do everything I can to protect their lives, and that includes you. I have a duty to keep you safe in the most trying of environments, and you are not helping me by running off. Eudora Vane had something to do with what happened to Dad. I need to know. The tight lump in his throat stopped him from saying any more. He swallowed back, trying not to burst into tears in front of Harriet. She sat in the snow, leaning against a pine tree. If you'd stayed still long enough to listen, I would have told you of my plan. You have a plan? He sat against the tree beside her. Harriet smiled. Always. I'm thinking we rest here for the short night, and at first light we head for the frozen lake with a core team of 4. I need as many as I can to stay and salvage what's left of the Aurora. The front half of the ship looks viable, and the main balloon is intact. The blown pump is irreparable, but the other is relatively undamaged, so I'm instructing the crew to make a half ship out of the usable parts. Welby will be in charge here, directing the majority on repairs, while the core team will attempt to make it to South Polaris. When we return, the crew will hopefully have made a skyship able to get us back to Salongo at the last post. He looked at the snowy forest floor, hoping beyond everything she meant that he was going onwards with her. We? Yes, I want you to be part of the core team. I've seen your drive and resilience, and I know that I couldn't separate you from Maudie, as much as I think her engineering skills would be of use here with Welby. Forbes will be sufficient. We can't carry many supplies, so Felicity's food knowledge can keep us alive when things become more extreme. And Ginny can take care of the food for the rest of the crew back here. We'll be on rations and it will be colder than you've ever experienced, but I know you can do this, and I know how much clearing your family name means to you. He could hardly speak. There was still hope. Harriet continued. Giving up is not in my nature, or yours, it seems, but you must stop and think before acting, and you'll need to listen, not just to me, but to everyone. I can't have you taking off like that again. She raised her eyebrows. Sorry, it felt as though it was just slipping away. But Arthur stopped suddenly. Sure, he glimpsed strange shapes through the trees and small circles of light reflecting in the dark. He stared, squinting into the forest. What is it? Harriet said. The breath froze in his throat as he realized that the lights were piercing green eyes staring right at them. That's the end of the chapter. You will have to listen again on Monday to find out who or what the eyes belong to. I hope you have a lovely weekend, and I'll see you very soon. Goodbye.